Good morning, everybody. So, as Travis said, my name is Erik. I'm from the API Academy. We are sponsored by CA Technologies, in full disclosure. But we have a really nice job in the sense that we get to travel around to these events, talk to a lot of interesting people, and spend our time doing research and also speaking at public events. So what I want to talk about today a little bit is, I think, pretty much a follow-up with what Bill talked about, which is mostly about the fact that how do you look at the really long-term, the famous quote from Roy, right, that talks about design for decades, right? How do you do that? And when you look at the web, the interesting thing really is that the web apparently manages to do that pretty well, right? It has been around for decades now. And so far, it's doing fine. And a lot of things are changing within the web. On the other hand, a lot of stuff remains constant. And that's very interesting and challenging and a very productive balance, right? How do you balance that stability on the one hand and the dynamic that you need on the other hand? Right. So what I want to talk about today is just a little bit of how far APIs have gone. One challenge that we see when we talk to people about APIs who are not really from the technical side of things. So I think when we look at this room, right, we're all excited about APIs, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But when you talk about people more from the business side of things, in many cases, they're not really that excited about APIs, right? They're more asking, why should I care? What is it all about? What's in it for me? So I think there's an interesting question of how do we communicate why APIs matter, how they matter, and what the really important things are that make APIs so important, right? And part of that, I think, is this movement that we've seen that has all kinds of names. The name that personally I'm preferring right now is digital transformation, but there's many labels you can attach to that, right? That basically just means companies are increasingly seeing themselves as restructuring themselves into something that has organizational boundaries that have technical alignments, right? Where the idea is that you set up your company in a way that what you're doing is also aligned with how you're doing it, and then it's easier for you to restructure and rebuild yourself when you have to. No, thanks. Sorry for that. I need to be faster, apparently. So that's me. Let's skip that. So very quickly, what our team is doing, right? We talk a lot of those events, and for me, the interesting feedback really often is to figure out what do people want to do with APIs. Because in the end, I'm a technologist. I have been working mostly on web technologies for most of my professional life. And it's very exciting now to see that more and more of the technology is moving into the business space, and that the business side is also getting mildly excited about APIs, right? But mostly not so much about APIs, but about the fact that people are telling them, hey, you should look at this, right? It's important. And so what we do is really trying to find this balance of communicating about APIs, explaining to people why APIs matter, and like I said, keep in mind, in a lot of situations, those people do not have an inherent interest in APIs, right? If you come from the business side of things, you're not really into APIs, into cool technologies, into the nice ways how you can build things faster, right? Mostly you're interested in how can I set up my organization better so that it makes more money or is more successful. And the way how we do that as the little team that we are, there's just 4 of us. I'm based in Switzerland. We have one guy, Ronnie Mitra, in London, and then I have 2 colleagues in the States. And the way that we approach that is we work a lot in the space. We talk to customers. We also participate in community things, such as writing on blogs, writing articles. We even write books. This book specifically has not been written by myself, so I can shamelessly plug it here. This has been written by my colleagues before I joined. If you're interested in a copy of that, you can find it out there at the CA booth. We have a whole bunch of copies with us. So part of the activities that we're doing is really trying to communicate what's going on in the space and trying to do that in a way that speaks to everybody, not just to technologists. And that is something that, to me, coming from a web space, is really interesting because coming from a web space, I realized that when microservices became all the rage, to me, it was the first time that I said, hey, enterprise IT is getting it, right? They're trying to build things in the same way that the web succeeded, right? Build things in very isolated ways, make sure that everything is self-contained, everything can be tested very quickly, everything can be looked at, and it can be decided, is it successful, is it worth the effort? If not, you can throw it away without shooting yourself in the foot. So it's a very quick way of playing with different components and making sure that this playing is not too expensive for you, right? And that's very much what happened on the web, right? Where also, when you look at the web at the global scale, the reason why the web was so successful is that different websites could just come up. If they're successful, they have to be scaled, and they will succeed. If they're not successful, they just die. That's fine too. The web itself doesn't get disrupted, right? The web continues to grow and evolve, and it's very isolated. You have no idea how your favorite website is implemented, right? I'm pretty sure when you go to your favorite website, sites, let's say your 10 favorite websites, right? I'm pretty sure for all 10 of those, you have no idea how it's implemented, right? How they run the code, how they store the data. And that's very good, right? Because you shouldn't have to. It should be something that you don't really know about. So when you look at microservices this way, right, it's the first time really that the enterprise IT space has embraced the way how the web works. But what that also means is that things get more diverse and agile. And now there's one slide that I've mostly created to make my colleagues angry because they don't like me saying that. But when you look at microservices, right, it still is service-oriented architecture, right? It's SOA almost these days now is a bad word. People don't want to use it because it's stained by soap and who knows what, right? Whatever your favorite web service pet peeve is. But in the end, microservices are about services, right? They are about how do you create that environment where all these services can be developed, built, and deployed in an independent way, and how do you do that so that it makes you more effective as an organization. What that means for us is that we can apply a lot of the lessons that we learned in SOA land, right? We can also apply a lot of things that we learned that are not so great about maybe the first wave of web services. But it still means that microservices tell us we have to treat the landscape that we create as a service-oriented landscape, right? It's a landscape of services. And how do we communicate best to people who are not excited about APIs, who may never have heard about SOA, who probably are also not excited about REST? How can we explain to them what we're doing, right? How we're kind of restructuring the landscape of the IT foundation and how that might affect the business side of things and how those two sides should talk better to each other. And what I have tried to do recently with very mixed success, and I am very curious to get some feedback from you, is explaining services in a way that at least is something that is understandable to everybody. And what I call this is the Kafka method. So who here in the room knows Franz Kafka? Not Kafka, the messaging middleware, but Franz Kafka, the writer. Ah, thank you. Very good, very good. It's always nicer on this side of the ocean. When you ask in America, it's just like 5 people saying, okay. So yeah, it's a very European thing, I guess, right? And so the story goes like this, right? Like Franz Kafka, those of you who don't know them, right? He was a German-speaking writer from the Czech Republic, or actually Poland, I think. I don't know, doesn't matter. Who wrote about a lot of the estrangement of man against sort of the environment that man lives in, and in particular government structures, right? And he wrote a lot about bureaucracy, right? And the way how you get very isolated from what's happening when you have to interact with bureaucracy. And there's a great book, and anybody who's in the API space, I think, should read The Castle. It's kind of a big API novel, so to speak, right, where he talks about his attempt to the story is he moves to a new town and he basically just wants to register. He just wants to say, hey, I'm living here now, right? And he goes through those long cycles of having to go to this office and this office and this office and talk to them about all kinds of things that are not really doing what he wants to do, but all these different things that he has to get done to go through his own personal workflow, right? Where in the end he just wants to say, okay, now I'm allowed to be here. Well, long story short, so in the end he dies. But that's not really the story I want to paint here. But the point is more that this picture of, see, and this is why it doesn't always work so well, because Kafka is not such a positive writer. But he's, I think, a perfect writer in terms of describing how those processes work, right? And what I really want to talk about, so let's be a little bit more positive, right, is that when you look at bureaucracy, and bureaucracy has an image problem, right, to me. So bureaucracy really actually is APIs, right? It's perfect APIs. It's designing ways how you interact with functional units, and those functional units are designed to be encapsulated. You have no idea what government agencies are doing or how they're doing it. The only way you interact with them is through forms, right? You submit a form, you wait, you get back a form, you may submit that to a different process. Government units can scale very well, right? If an office is too slow, they just hire more workers, they have to train them, and then the office hopefully gets more efficient, right? And of course, there's all kinds of real-world problems with that. But the main point I'm trying to make here is explaining to people that the structure that evolved in bureaucracy, and I'm still trying to find really good books, which is surprisingly hard, about the history of bureaucracy, right? Where did it start? And it goes back, as far as I've found out so far, back to the Sumerians, right? Very far back, where they had to keep a register of who owns what and these kind of things, right? But the point is, the structure of those systems evolved, right? It's nobody sat down and said, let's do bureaucracy, right? Because it will torture people. It's more that bureaucracy evolved because people wanted to have scalable systems with stable interfaces, essentially, right? And the main thing about that, I think, is that there's a lot to be learned from how bureaucracy evolved, where it works, where it doesn't work, and how we can apply those lessons to restructuring our organizations. And saying, well, okay, our APIs are a little different, and our offices are a little different, but ideally we want to have the same setup, right? We want to have isolated processing units with well-defined inputs and outputs, and we want to have a plan how we combine them. Ideally, we also want to have a plan how we can compose them, so that if you need 3 government services, there's a process that actually guides you through that. And I think what we need in the end as API people is a better storyline to communicate this in some way, right? Maybe you find a better story than Kafka, but I think just trying to explain what is the substance of an API-centric landscape and this digital transformation into APIs, I think that is something that is not easy to do when you talk to people who are not inherently enthusiastic about APIs, who just basically ask you, well, why should I care, right? What's in it? What does it help in terms of making my organization better? And when you look at where we're going with APIs, and that was what Travis was pointing out initially, right? We're really focusing more and more on APIs and say everything has to be around the API because we're really trying to build robust platforms, but we also understand that they will evolve a little bit over time, because if you define something now, very unlikely it will be the same thing in 10 years from now. I mean, it may have the same label, but it probably works a little different, right? So how do you work with that? How do you allow those things to be evolvable without breaking everything? And I think really there's a lot of material that we can learn, and there's a lot of design practice, not just from the bureaucracy space, which apparently goes back like thousands of years, but also from the web space, which at least goes back decades, where we have learned things that we can actually apply to our API challenges today. Right, and coming back to something that is a little bit more up to date, right? When you look at microservices nowadays and you relate that to the Kafka picture, basically what you end up, I think, is this, right? So these are enthusiastic little office workers. So imagine that you have the castle, right, which is your legacy system. And now you have these new things coming around, right, where people say, oh, we should do microservices and it will be fast and we can do interesting things. Now, what your job is basically when you try to build an API platform, you try to design APIs, is control these little guys who, if you've seen any movie with those, you know that they're highly enthusiastic in what they're doing, but they also need guidance, right? They need to be put into spaces where they can play safely. And I think now what we see developing in a lot of places is where people talk about bimodal IT, right? And basically what people talk about is saying, how can we probably, as let's say an older organization, still have the castle, the old school system that works as it always worked, and it probably will be around for a long time. And we can also have those guys doing cool new things next to it, and they actually can play safely with each other, right? And we have well-defined interfaces how they can talk to each other. And the challenge that we have nowadays, I think, is really, and that in our case, since we do a lot of work in the microservices space, the challenge there really is how do we approach that problem or that issue of taking those guys and creating those safe spaces for them and the APIs around them so that they can interact safely with those older systems, right? But again, I think in the end, what it comes down to is explaining to people how the landscape looks like, what we have nowadays, that we often have this disparity of old school things that work in some way and new school things that hopefully are more agile, but still need to play along with the old school things. And having a good way how to explain that is something that I think will also help the people who actually, in the end, use the APIs and want them for the business reasons, right? How they can best understand what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how we can communicate to each other how the whole landscape should evolve. So the reason why I think it really is interesting and important to think about this dichotomy almost, right, between the old school stuff and the new stuff is that in reality, when you talk to bigger organizations, you always end up in that space where people say, yeah, we have the castle, we have the monolith, we have this big thing, and that is not going to go away anytime soon, right? And that's fine. And how to best design your landscape in a way that you can balance that stability of the castle and the speed of those little enthusiastic guys. I think that is something where lessons of API evolvability, API stability, API documentation, the findabilities of APIs, all the things that Bill was also talking about, how all those things come together and tell us this story of, in the end, that APIs have this role which is almost ironic, right? APIs have this role. On the one hand, they have to be connecting, right? APIs are the thing that connects me or that connects services. So that's the job that they should be doing. On the other hand, they also are supposed to isolate things, right? They should enable connections, but they also should isolate things well enough, encapsulate things so that those connections are as loose as possible, right? Avoiding tight coupling, that is one of the big themes in Roy Fielding's work and a lot of web architecture, right? We know we need to connect components, but we want to connect them in a loosely coupled way. And I think the practices and the body of knowledge around how loose coupling can be defined and how you design things with loose coupling in mind, what are the things you should keep in mind when you design things, trying to understand, am I creating more coupling than I have to? I think those things really still are an evolving space. We don't have enough resources where people can learn about it, where people can check their designs, where you can have a conversation about this. Basically, when somebody gives you a design, right? Travis was also mentioning those, no, I think it was actually Bill. Whatever. One of my speakers before myself, right, they were mentioning the increasing availability of API design books or guidelines, right, where companies try to create those. And I think those also should basically have checklists about coupling, right? Like, show me your API and prove to me or make your point why it is as loosely coupled as it can possibly be. Because if you don't design it that way, we are going to pay for it later on, right? And that's the one thing that we really want to avoid. And I think that's really something where we as API practitioners and as people who work in that space mainly have potential to do that in a better way, in a more structured way, and communicate that in ways that we have ways of talking about it, we have ways of explaining it to somebody, and we have ways of checking it when we look at designs. And what it all comes down to me is really that we have to look at those APIs that we're designing. We have to design them in ways that hopefully are loosely coupled. And since we have those guys, right, who now also are responsible for designing their APIs and documenting them, we also have to become better at documenting what they do, letting them document what they do, and then deal with it, right? So there's this idea of discovery, basically Google-style things for web APIs, right? And that's still something that is evolving. But right now, you see a lot of organizations also struggling a little bit with, should we have everything centralized about our APIs? Should we be more decentralized? And to me, it's actually something where I would assume that over time, there will be a natural shift for documentation and description things to be more decentralized. I mean, right now, we have sort of a small set of maybe popular API description formats. But I would bet that when you look at APIs in 10 years or 20 years, right, they will still be around. Probably we won't call them APIs anymore. We will have a different label for them. But they will be around. But those formats won't be. They will be so uncool, right? They will be those API description formats from 2016. Like, who would use them now, right? So having a better plan of how you just treat those things over time, manage them over time, make them accessible over time, right? That is something where I think you will also see quite a bit of work coming up. And frankly, so far, there really hasn't been that much, right? It's basically the same struggle that you can see, even though the web has transformed so tremendously, right? When you look at where the web is today as compared to where it was 10 years ago, the one thing that is surprisingly similar, right, is Google. I mean, Google, of course, I mean, they work much better now, and they're much smarter, and they have better algorithms and everything. But essentially, right, the way how they function, that you type in your words and they send you where you probably want to go, that has remained very stable, right? And I think something akin to that is still something that we're struggling to find and to build. But my bet is that things will go into that direction, right? We will have a more decentralized way of doing that, and the way how we can maybe start doing that is making this documentation more open, description more open, and then letting other services do something with it, right? In the same way as you publish your documentation, you make it crawlable, and then hopefully that leads to some search engine sending people to you, right? That's your hope. And what this all comes down to, in my mind, is really that this idea of service discovery, that right now we have mostly starting from this old view of we would have service discovery in the old monolith world, right, where we will build all of our web services. And you can actually, that's kind of the same picture like the castle, right? It's one complex machinery that does all kinds of things, and you might be able to find out what it does by basically looking at all the bits and pieces. Now, what microservices tell us is to go away from that and have more diverse documentation and description, and make things also findable in different ways. So what microservices tell us, well, basically is to go away from this monolith of services that we used to have and come up with something like this, right? A nice toolbox of services, they all have APIs. And I think the wrong message that some people take away from microservices is that we will have this, right? And I don't think we will have this. Because this is kind of the picture that you would have if you would have a lot of imposed guidelines, right? Where you told people you have to do it like this. So I'm German, so these are all tools made by German norms. So I think they are very good tools, right? Because they all follow the German norms. But that is a very top-down process, right? Where you say everybody has to build their tools according to how German tools have to look like. That makes tool building very easy. It also makes tool finding very easy because you can probably just look for the part number and you're done, right? But what microservices are telling us, and what I think is the really nice webby facet to microservices, is that we will not have this, right? Instead, we will have this, right? So microservices tell us every team that is building solutions get to pick whatever they like as building their solution. And they will pick it according to their needs, to their preferences, to the problems that they have in front of them. And you will end up with a very diverse landscape of things, right? And I think that is the diversity and decentralization challenge ahead of us that we don't really have a very, very good answer for right now. And I think that's, for me personally, that exciting because that's job security, right? We can keep on doing this for quite a while until we have the perfect picture how to manage that landscape. And the way how you can do that, to me, is something where we can learn a lot from the web, right? Where the web has the same idea of websites, web services, right? Not talking about SOAP web services, but sort of the services that are behind websites, right? They come in all kinds of shapes and forms. Some of them you like, some of them you don't like. There's very little alignment in their design. People just build a website, throw it out, and wait for people to use it or not to use it, right? And hopefully we will have the same kind of dynamics in microservices. And if that happens, and we see that happening more and more in places where microservices are actually used in anger, then I think you will end up with this. And right now what you see is that a lot of the places that use microservices heavily, they start building their own tooling, right, for managing the landscape. And that is not something that a lot of us can afford, right? If you're Netflix or Amazon or Twitter, I mean, you can have a couple hundred people working on the tooling, right? That's fine. But that's not something that a lot of companies can and probably should do, right? It's not really a good story if you say, yeah, you can do microservices, but you also have to build a lot of tooling just to manage your microservices landscape. So I think a lot of the tooling around that landscape, that is something where we see some patterns emerging, how people are doing it, how companies are using that successfully. But we really haven't seen a lot of products coming to market, in my mind, that actually do that well for you, right? And to me, that's, like I said, exciting because that means we will see much more of that over time. When companies going through this digital transformation, or however you want to call it, right, you will see that they run into those problems, they see this landscape, they might like it for business reasons and say, hey, we can solve all these interesting problems because we have this diverse tool set, but we also really need to know what we're doing. So what do you have, right? And if we had better tools to give to them, which is kind of meta, right? So we need tools to manage the tools. But if we had a better story for that, I think the API landscape as a whole will only benefit from that, right? Because we can better deal with diversity and decentralization and make sure that we can put more effort into actually developing those things because we have better ways of managing them. So to me, one big development that we will see is really that decentralized documentation and discovery is something that you will see more and more. Right? People will move away from those centralization aspects, and we'll try to give service teams more authority to make the choices that they want to make in terms of designing their APIs, documenting their APIs, describing their APIs, making them discoverable. And what your job as an API gardener or API landscape manager will be to actually help them be successful in that environment, right? By building tools or buying tools or combining tools. And to me, what that also means, and that's the really exciting part that I want to leave you with as my final message, is that once we do that, right, once we embrace the fact that instead of telling people how to design their APIs exactly, how to document them, how to describe them, we give them the authority to do that as they think works best for them. Once we do that, we also have a really, really good feedback loop to see what works best for people. What are people using in the field? What can we recommend to people and say, out of the 800 services that we have in our organization, 500 are doing it like this. You might want to check it out because that seems to be the new way of doing things. And we think if all of our teams are doing it that way, that's probably a good sign, right? So you can not just embrace the diversity better, you can also learn from it and evolve over time because, right, if there's one thing that you can also learn from the web is that even though the web as an ecosystem has been tremendously successful, one of the main reasons why it has been is that you will be very hard-pressed to find any website nowadays that looks the same as it did 10 or 15 years ago, right? They all evolve. They have to. And that's the success that really makes the web possible, is that everything changes all the time. The ecosystem remains kind of stable, right? But different parts evolve over time, and they do so by looking at what do other people do, right? That's an interesting thing. We probably should do the same thing, right? So that dynamics, I think, of the web is something that still will take a long time for us to learn from, but I think it's something that naturally we will be pushed to more and more. Okay, with that, I want to really conclude. So the one thing that I really wanted to talk about is mostly that instead of having this idea of this top-down process of how to design and document and describe APIs, I think what we will see is a much more ecosystem-like approach, which is why I picked this title of gardening and landscaping, these kind of pictures of, instead of trying to build everything the way that I think it should look, try to build things more in a way that you create the conditions under which you think that good things will happen, right? And then hopefully they will, right? That's the thing. And if they don't, at least you have had a better way of experimenting, and then you can tweak the conditions, hopefully, to make your ecosystem more successful. Okay, and with that, I'm finished. If you have any questions, do we have some time for that? Okay, we have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Do we have a question from the audience? Yep. Great. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah. So perhaps some people are wondering in the audience.
Why Kafka?
Yeah, why Kafka? I'm glad you didn't talk about the metamorphosis, though.
Yeah, that's the next
gross.
talk.
Yeah, that's hauntings from my English curriculum right there. But in all seriousness, perhaps people are wondering, how can an enterprise adopt a microservices architecture without throwing away some complete existing architecture? Or does what you're talking about necessitate a complete redesign?
Yeah, it's the very good question. You hear that question a lot, right? It's like, what now, right? Do we just throw away our castle? And no, you don't, right? So, I mean, that's basically why we have this bimodal IT thing now, right? Because people are saying that, or let's not look at those guys, let's look at this, right? Where companies are saying, well, we will not, and it wouldn't make any sense on any level, throw away our legacy IT, right? So what you see is these patterns emerging where this bimodal IT basically says, on the one hand, you're still managing your old big thing because that's critical to your business and you know that you have to keep it around. But you also start, let's stay with that little picture, a new little garden over here, right, where you grow the interesting things or the more dynamic things, and you try to do that in a way that those things connect well. And then what you also sometimes see, if companies have a relatively aggressive goal of actually replacing their legacy system, right? There's this notion of the strangler pattern where you have these new services growing around the old thing, and at some point they have completely strangled the old thing to death because parts of the old thing will be replaced over time, and at some point it just won't be visible anymore. So this another metaphor or another imagery, right, is this idea of a tree, and then there's this vine growing around it, and at some point you can't see the tree anymore because there's these vines that strangle the tree. And that's one pattern that you see where companies are saying, yes, we have this old system, it needs to stay there, and then we know it will stay there for another 10, 20 years. But we also need to be faster, at least with developing new products, playing around with new products, having a strategy how to do that. And then you often end up in this bimodal space where companies say, yes, we're trying to balance safety and speed. Safety is more we still manage the castle, and speed is, we also have some of those guys, right? And then what you often see, actually, what's happening, if you look at what companies are doing, you have these graphs of code, lines of, let's do it for you, right? Lines of code over time, and then there's the monolith, right? And then the new code, and hopefully over time, the code growth in the monolith goes to zero or slows, and the code growth in the new cool stuff grows more and more. And then at some point in time, maybe you really want to replace the monolith. But realistically speaking, in really big organizations, just 2 weeks ago, we had another API event in London where you have a lot of banks, right? And if you talk to the banks about replacing their monolith anytime soon, they just go, yeah, sure, we're going to do that, right? So, yeah. So usually people come up with these ideas of doing things in parallel and just trying to make sure that they work well together.
Great. All right, Erik,
Okay.
thanks again.
Thank you very much.